Welcome to this edition of Risk Radar. Today we'll be talking about identity governance and administration, and in particular, IGA's effect on technical attacks, including ransomware exploits. And I'm delighted to be joined by Colin Ross from Anetac and Harold Edison from Edison Litigation Technology Advisory Services. So let's start by asking you both to introduce yourself and your organizations. Colin, do you want to lead off?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Thanks for having us on. So I'm Colin Ross. I'm one of the co-founders of Anetac, and Anetac is focused on helping people understand their service account.
Hi, I'm Harold Edison, the founder of Edison Litigation on digital forensics. Our core service, we provide incident response, particularly as it relates to forensics and identifying your threats, exfiltrations, infiltrations, and remediation. One of our goals is to make sure that we educate the community on how to prepare themselves for the next attack or prevent themselves from being attacked.
Great. It's great to have you both here today. And let's jump straight in. With a technical security incident, we often talk in terms of there being an attack surface, and then they break through with some kind of entry vector, and then proceed with lateral movement, elevation of privilege, and then get to the business impact, which is their goal. So, to what degree are previously compromised credentials used to attack to achieve that entry vector? I mean, the breach credentials are easy to find on the dark web, right? I mean, do you see that a lot, Harold?
Yes, most of the EVs that we're experiencing come by, to be honest with you, is surprising phishing attempts, right? They're sending straight emails into to email accounts and corporate levels, and folks are still filling out information that allows that particular account to be compromised. And then once they're in, the lateral movement is all based on whatever that user's credentials are. I see where, if IGA were implemented or if it existed, it could provide a second level of security inside the network itself and prevent that lateral movement from taking place.
Colin, any history you see with people turning up with credentials in hand, ready to walk into the enterprise?
Yeah, I mean we've seen similar to Harold there. The phishing attacks are very popular way in because you don't have to have an administrative account to start making headway in the environment. You just have to have an account that can access something. And once it's got to that something, and this is your lateral movement, right? Once you've got that something, then you look at, well, how do I escalate privileges from here to get something else? Yeah, we see very similar to Harold.
And if it's coming in from a phishing attack, that's going to be a user credential. But we see a lot of credentials out on the dark web from just previous breaches where they've harvested databases full of credentials, or perhaps run them through crackers and reverse the hashes. So, do people walk in with service account credentials at the front door as well, or do they always tend to start with the user accounts, Colin?
Typically, your service accounts are going to be inside. If you know a service account credential, though, that's pretty big because one of the issues with service accounts is that the credentials are very often difficult to rotate because people don't understand, well, where are those service accounts used? What is the impact of me rotating this credential? Am I going to break something significant?
Yep.
So your service accounts very often, the credential isn't rotated for long periods of time. And what we see very often is that they're actually in groups within their IAM systems. The groups have some sort of name like "Don't rotate these credentials," things like that. So if somebody's found a service account in a database somewhere, there's a very good chance that that service account is still active, and there's a very good chance that it is a privilege.
Yeah, and something that I've seen is that people, when they get to service accounts, they just give them all the privileges that they can because it's just going to be used by a computer, not a human. So they just put them into domain admin or whatever. And even we've seen all sorts of credentials that are valid for external access and remote entry, maybe work on the VPN for no apparent reason. And the just credentials are greatly overprivileged. When you see attacks taking place, Harold, how often are the service accounts used in preference to the user accounts to actually propagate through the environment? Is that kind of the crown jewels that they're going for, is to find one of these highly privileged accounts so they can propagate more easily?
Absolutely. You figure that the phishing attempt provides access, as Colin was saying, And once they have access, the elevation would be to tap into a service account that will allow them to move laterally without sounding any alarms. If they have a service account and they're not sure of the credentials, they may trigger an alarm if they're trying to move laterally from one server to another. Access denied, access denied, access denied. By the sixth time you fired off an alert, the security team now they're aware that you're in their network. So having a service account, especially if there's a service account that's on the dark web, that just wreaks a lot of gaps in the remediation. Meaning that when that account was taken and it was posted out there on the dark web somewhere, someone didn't go through and do the proper remediation steps of changing passwords or even changing group policies and updating or even moving to an IGA type of a system that will allow them to do those things automatically.
As we say, people get in, they achieve their entry vector, and then it's all lateral movement and privilege escalation. Um, those two motions seem to me to be uniquely identity or credential related issues, right? If you're moving laterally in through the environment, it's through the use of a credential. If you're trying to escalate privilege, you're jumping between credentials and trying to move forward that way. Yet some organizations seem to focus on EDR to detect threat actors in their environment. Why do you think there's such a focus on technical controls in a defense and detection sense, rather than just limiting the risk associated with each of those credentials? Colin?
I think honestly that it's very difficult to understand how you can stop this happening, right? People want to implement anything they have, right? So and a lot of people have multiple different layers of things that they're implementing because they don't really have one specific thing that will go ahead and solve the entire problem. I don't think you're going to see that change in the future. I think you're always going to have layers of things that look at the world slightly differently, but give you different detections and different ways of looking at things to give you that bigger picture.
What do you see, Harold? People relying on their EDRs to catch people when they're inside, or lots of investment in deprivileging credentials and other technical controls to stop them getting in and moving around?
There's a false sense of security with that, right? That we're saying. Unfortunately, that false sense is exploited at the time that the attackers are successful. So if we're called in as part of the incident response team, and our job is to go in and identify an EV, well, the threat actors already penetrated and did what he had to do. So whatever you had in place, clearly it's not working. That brings up a good topic, something that I personally would like to see happen. I would like to see more tabletop exercises as relates to these type of solutions being deployed, and knowing what you don't know before attack happens, and you realize that, oh, the sense of security needed some additional tweaking, or it may needed some type of a centralization in order to make sure that that those gaps have been identified and closed off.
I absolutely agree. And in fact, I would go further. I think tabletops are essential, but also real world red team exercises. Actually have somebody come in and start wandering around and behaving
Yep.
like an attacker and see if the alarms go off as you expect them to. Because all too often you have all these SOC and SIM solutions and technologies, and either the alerts don't go off, or the alerts do go off and they're not prioritized correctly, or they're just ignored.
Yep.
Right?
Agreed. Yep.
So when managing the identities, right, the easy wins are, I think, least privilege, password rotation, and credential auditing, right? So what other controls can limit the value of a credential to an attacker?
For what we're seeing in most of the ransomware attacks, it's just really making sure that you centralized all of your logging, making sure that that's integrated. And my dream would be to see a SEM and an IGA working together hand in hand. That way, you have logging taking place on your devices they're populating your SEM, but then within your access control, centralized access control, that can also be a good way to hand off in the event that a user comes in that's been compromised, and you know that that user doesn't have the privileges to get to be where they are on a particular network. Then by being informed by what's happening on the SEM, how they get in, It came in from an IP address that's not nowhere close to what we usually have access to. Those are all good elements right there that can be flagged, and they can inform each other, assuming that those controls are in place.
Cool. And Colin, I know the Anetac tool actually looks at credentials and kind of risk ranks them to say which ones are the scary ones with the larger blast radius. Other than the age of the credential and how long since the password was rotated, what kind of features are you looking at there?
Yeah, so we use a whole bunch of things, including the behaviors of those credentials, the footprints of those credentials. What is it they're connecting to? What is it the privileges that they have? You need to look at the whole picture to fix this problem, right? If you've got more than a couple of hundred accounts, which any large enterprise has, you've got to give them a path which doesn't involve, here's a load of data, choose a starting point. People get this anxiety over, well, where should I start? So helping them understand, well, which accounts are my riskiest ones? Which are the highest privilege with the largest footprint that run NTLM, that do XYZ, that behave like this? Those are maybe the ones you should be looking at first. Those that have the ability to get to your crown jewels, your databases, your payment gateways, whatever those are perhaps the ones you should be considering first, right? The money accounts.
Yep. At the moment, it seems every talk and presentation I go to is focused on AI. But before that, it seemed that everything was about zero trust and microsegmentation and similar technologies, which in effect, they're trying to reduce the value to the attacker of a credential or the entry vector, the beachhead that they establish. Those kind of technologies, zero trust, microsegmentation, and friends, do you think that they entirely mitigate poor identity governance, or is IGA a quick win that you can achieve whilst architecting those more complex, challenging approaches? I mean, where do you see them in relation to each other, Harold?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I see them being both equally valued to each other. It will solve not just the immediate problem, like you mentioned, zero trust, right? Zero trust address one specific issue, but then one specific issue is successful as long as until the attackers figure out the workaround. And the workaround is still going to be entry vectors and then permission elevation. And so if we already jump ahead of that and just make sure that we have the controls in place, an IG type of platform, feeding and informing a SIM and back and forth, right? Those things allow, like from a forensic standpoint, it allows us to really be able to have the type of collaborative view that we will need to be able to say, oh, I see now we do have gaps over here. And again, that would feed right into like a tabletop exercise, right? Because then we can do things like testing. I kind of think of it like this: when you build a building, you put in a fire suppression system, you're going to test it before you put the walls in, right? Well, it's the exact same concept here. If you put in a security platform, we should test it before you allow that platform to go live.
Colin, IGA versus zero trust and microsegmentation and friends?
Well, I mean, I think ultimately IGA is part of your zero trust, right? Zero trust isn't just about network. Zero trust goes all the way up the stack. The problem with zero trust is the overhead that it adds in. And how do you get there? You have to be able to define everything that happens in your environment and define for each thing that happens whether it should happen or not, and then create a policy to allow it to happen or not. That's huge complexity. A lot of big enterprises have no idea how their applications work, how their service accounts work in those applications, which service account does what, which service account goes from where to where. That journey of zero trust, I agree with Harold. It's a great journey to do, and it should do a lot with mitigation of this problem. But it's unwieldy. It's hard to get there.
And Colin, I know Anetac has a particular focus on service accounts rather than the usual focus that we see in many other tools on user accounts. Are the organizations that you work with surprised when you shine a light on this huge bucket of risk that they didn't know they had?
Every single company we've spoken to, and this is hundreds of companies, has said to us that this is a massive, massive problem. they know that they have a problem, but as with anything is they don't know what they don't know. So, but every time we deploy into a new company, they are surprised by what they see. And most of the time they spin up new projects because of what we show them.
And is that just small business or are enterprise clients equally at risk, or is it worse?
This is not vertical specific. This is not size specific. This is an everyone's problem. The companies that are regulated have the biggest problem, right? They all have the problem, but regulated companies, they're beginning to get to the point where they have to do something about it because regulations are turning identity away from just a user conversation and they're turning it into a conversation about entities. In fact, PCI 4.0 actually now mentions by name service accounts. This is coming and people know it's coming. So it's something that people have to tackle.
And Harold, this is going to sound like a silly question, I know, but I really want to emphasize the importance of good identity management. Have you ever, I mean, your business, you're involved in helping clients when they've had a breach and helping them understand what happened and how it happened. So you've been in the heat of battle many, many times. Have you ever been involved in a technical incident response where the business impact occurred without the attacker ever having possession or use of a credential?
We had a particular incident where a person's cell phone that had their Microsoft Authenticator on it, and the cell phone itself didn't have a password code to access the phone, right? And so for me, that was an IoT issue right there. But the crown jewel was grabbing the device that had MFA, and all you have to do was swipe to get into it. And then from there, they were able to access, get into the platform, get into the network. And when we traced the entrance vector. They were able to clone the IMI number of that particular phone and actually use it to obtain more credentials onto the person's computer. And then from there, they're moving laterally. Okay. And in that instance right there, there are all kind of guardrails that, had they been in place, could have triggered an alert that could have shut the account down just by way of saying, oh, when we went in and investigated, we investigated that the entrance vector IP address came from another country. And so back to what Colin was saying, if we're able to see those things, but we don't have any policies written in order to basically to manage what happens when you do see them, well, then now you're vulnerable. Okay.
Yep.
And then now here comes an incident team like us, and we're looking at the forensics and we're seeing and we're tracing it and we're just going, wow, what a cluster.
Even when the EV wasn't particularly credential focused, you're saying that as soon as they got inside, they were then hopping between credentials
Correct.
with the lateral movement and elevating a privilege, right?
Yeah.
We've been talking a lot about identity governance and administration, IGA, and there are a lot of tools that are labeled as IGA tools. What would you say is the umbrella description for what IGA represents, Harold?
For me, it would be a labor intensive process that, such as access certifications, access requests, password management, provisioning, anything that can lower the operational costs. Some companies, they use MFA, but some don't because it's cost prohibitive. Others may use some type of tokenized randomization with a fob. But again, it becomes cost prohibitive. What IGA provides is just an automated process that allows you to certify a user, and in a certification itself, it's randomized within the IGA platform itself, and it's always tokenizing back and forth to that user account. That takes the load off of IT, takes the load off of a lot of the cost prohibitive things that prevent one from going to an MFA type of a scenario.
Colin, thoughts on the umbrella description for what IGA should be trying to achieve?
I mean, I think at a high level, IGA is really a policy, right? It's something where you have a policy that includes regular access reviews, enhanced authentication, risk analysis, helps you get rapid response, user activity monitoring, and really helps you go down this path of least privilege, which is really essential. We can't keep giving either users or service accounts elevated privileges where they don't need it. Those things should be used sparingly. So I think from an IGA perspective, it's really helping you go down this policy path of how do I do this at scale? How do I securely onboard new accounts? How do I securely offboard new old accounts? Right. So I think that's really where your IGA is coming in.
There are many ways that the attackers use, not just for the entry vector, where they're using phishing or breach credentials or vulnerabilities, missing patches perhaps, or even just finding in a way that the defenders didn't think about and protect sufficiently. And then all sorts of different ways that they propagate through an environment. But so many of these techniques involve the use of credentials. Is IGA kind of the panacea that lifts up the security across the board in all places? What do you think, Colin?
It absolutely helps. But you need to be thinking about other policies that you need to use, right? So for example, Harold mentioned MFA. Your users should be using MFA where possible. The problem with MFA is that things like service accounts, they can't really use MFA. So what is better than a lot of people do now because they can't use MFA for service accounts? Well, look at things like vaulting, right? One-time passwords via a vault. Still not a perfect solution. If somebody accesses that machine that's running the software that gets that credential out of that vault, then they can get that credential out of that vault. So it's not perfect, but we have to make steps forward, as imperfect as they may be, to get better.
Harold, identity governance, reducing a risk across all the vulnerability vectors?
I think that what identity governance will also do, it will provide, I think it'll provide the matrix that can be used for an AI type of integration, marrying policies to the user. And then once it's trained, then now the alerting can happen a lot faster. And in alerts, we're also talking not just alerts, but also action items. Action items by way of, if you're trying to get into a particular area of the network, you don't have the policies, but then your account is shut down and then you're automatically sending things out. It's sending alerts over to your security teams. With that, I think that it'll allow the policies to be able to be implemented and managed on a much more efficient level.
And you've both mentioned multi-factor authentication, right? MFA, and even highlighted some weaknesses. Um, I There's a popular MFA proxy now available that you can download off the dark web, and it just does a man-in-the-middle attack, so it makes the user do their MFA through the channel and then just steals their session anyway, right? So it's been a struggle to get people to adopt MFA, and we're still definitely not there yet. And yet it's already showing weaknesses and problems with it not being the solution that we had hoped it was going to be. So where do we go next if MFA is not going to close the door on unauthorized credential use? What do we put in place as the alternative?
That's a good question. I don't think there's going to be a one size fits all solution. I think it's going to be a progression. For me, what I'm experiencing is in a discovery phase of a business, understanding the business itself and understanding the value that that business may have to an attacker will inform the priorities. Great, MFA is not the one all be all, but if you have MFA in addition to some type of a SIM platform, in addition to an IGA, well, then the three together can work hand in hand. But it's gonna require an investment and the planning and policy writing of those platforms to work together, right? So that the three together can at least give you a good starting point to take your first step. And then from there, you just take more steps as you inform through tabletop exercises.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So I always tell people that they should try really hard to protect the attack surface and avoid that initial entry vector and use controls like MFA to keep people out.
Yep.
but also then recognize that you're going to fail and they are going to get in. And so the second job is to impede progress and ideally block people's ability to get to the impact point, but at least slow them down to give the detection and response capabilities chance to find them during that dwell time while they're working their way through the environment. I mean, Colin, do you have any suggestions for how to mitigate the failures in NFA and the fact that it's getting harder and harder to keep people out?
You have to be able to have analytics that take into account things like what normally happens. And this isn't just at the user level, right? This is down at the service account level. You know, what normally happens? What is a baseline of normal here? And how do we flag up anomalous behavior? Now, the problem with going down that path is you want high fidelity things, right? User behavior is a very hard thing to describe, and with the best intentions in the world, you will likely to be left with a lot of false positives. So you've got to be a little careful of what you ask for. But you know, the visibility and a way to correlate masses of data to high fidelity pointers to there's something not right here. It's not necessarily just about the one account, right? It's about the chain of actions that might normally happen. Normally, this is the chain of actions that happens, whether it's a service or a user account, and that whole chain is now morphed into something else. That's a way to help kind of understand in a high fidelity way something's changed.
For closing thoughts, call to action. What would you tell an organization that wants to reduce its risk and it's looking at identity risk in particular? What would be your call to action for them, Colin?
So many people out there have basic hygiene problems that they can fix today. They're just not focused on that. You know, everybody's busy. So start with the basics. Let's start getting rid of the excess attack surface that you don't need, right? Accounts that have not been used for years and are still active in your environment, active meaning enabled. Get rid of them. You don't need that attack surface. Once you start doing some basic hygiene things, then you start having to go down. How can we make this better? How can we have more control, more visibility, more ability to automate things that are happening, automate response? These are the things that people should be thinking about.
Harold, call to action?
Yeah, so I'm going to piggyback on what Colin laid out, because what Colin laid out was pretty much a plan. Baseline first, take action, but then once you're done, test it. Get someone to come in and try and break into your network so you can identify up front where your vulnerabilities are. And then that right there will inform the edits to your policy and to your plan in order to make sure that, you know what, you put yourself now in a much better position than where you were in before.
Great advice from both of you. I appreciate it. All right. Thanks very much, guys. Thanks for sharing the time with us and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you for having me.
Take care.
Take care.
Thank you for having us.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Trivantis Risk Radar. We're a cybersecurity and privacy consulting firm focused on helping our clients manage risk, resilience, and trust for their organizations. Do let us know if we can help you in any way as you navigate through this ever-evolving threat landscape.